Oh, keep saying you want to hear God's voice, but let's be real. Most people aren't missing God's words. They're missing alignment. God hasn't stopped speaking. He's been talking, guiding, and directing since the beginning of time. But if you're not tuned in, if your heart is distracted, if your spirit is cluttered with noise, you'll never catch what heaven is broadcasting. You can't expect divine direction while you're scrolling through confusion and feeding on fear. God's voice isn't found in the chaos. It's found in clarity, and clarity comes when you align yourself with His presence, not your preferences. Some people think prayer is about talking until God responds, but prayer is about alignment. You're not trying to convince God to move. You're aligning yourself with His will so you can recognize when He does. God doesn't shout over your distractions. He whispers in your stillness. You can't hear that whisper if your mind is racing with anxiety, your heart is buried in doubt, and your focus is scattered on everything temporary. The one thing you're lacking isn't faith, it's focus. You're praying, but you're not listening. You're moving, but not waiting. You're asking, but not aligning. You've got to decide what matters more, the noise of the world or the voice of God, because one of them will always drown out the other. When you give more attention to your fears, your failures, and your frustrations, you disconnect from the very source of your guidance. God doesn't compete for your attention. He invites it. He's not going to fight through the static you keep feeding. You have to be intentional about your focus. Alignment doesn't happen by accident. It's a choice, a discipline, a decision to say, God, you come first. Your voice matters more than my feelings. You want to hear Him, then quiet everything else. You want His direction, then stop chasing validation from people who can't even direct their own lives. When you align with God, you don't just hear His words, you start to understand His timing. You realize that what feels like silence might actually be strategy. God's silence isn't a sign of absence. It's a signal of preparation. He's not ignoring you. He's aligning you. He's not holding you back. He's building your sensitivity. He's strengthening your faith muscle. So when He speaks next, you'll be ready to act without hesitation. When your heart and mind align with heaven, your spirit becomes a receiver for divine insight. You'll start catching things you used to miss. God will drop wisdom in your spirit in moments when everyone else feels lost. You'll walk into rooms with peace when everyone else walks in with panic. That's what happens when you tune your frequency to the voice of God. It's not about being perfect. It's about being positioned. When you're aligned, His voice doesn't feel distant. It feels daily. You start hearing Him in decisions, in disruptions, even in delays. Every moment becomes a message when you're connected. This is where most people fall short. They want God's voice without God's order. They want clarity without commitment. You can't expect revelation when you're not willing to surrender. Alignment requires obedience. It means letting go of what you think you know so God can fill you with what you actually need. Sometimes He'll stay silent just to see if you'll stay faithful. Sometimes He'll close doors just to see if you'll still trust His direction. If you only want to hear God when He says what you like, you'll never truly know His voice. But when you align your heart to listen, really listen, you'll realize He's been speaking the whole time. You say you want to hear God's voice, but your life is filled with too much noise to notice when He's speaking. You wake up to chaos, you scroll through distractions, and you wonder why heaven feels silent. God hasn't stopped speaking. You've just stopped listening. You've allowed the volume of the world to drown out the whisper of the Spirit. You can't hear divine instruction when you're constantly plugged into human opinions. The more you let distraction dominate your day, the less room there is for revelation. God's not going to compete with the noise you invite into your life. His voice requires space, silence, and surrender. When your heart is still, His voice becomes clear. But when your mind is cluttered, His message gets lost in the mix. You can't hear the King in a crowd of chaos. That's why God often speaks in stillness, because stillness exposes what really has your attention. If you're constantly busy, constantly worrying, constantly chasing after what's next, you'll never recognize when God's trying to guide you right where you are. He doesn't speak to impress you. He speaks to instruct you. But instruction requires focus. You can't follow what you won't prioritize. Every time you let distraction take the lead, you distance yourself from discernment. You lose sensitivity to the Spirit because you're tuned into the wrong frequency. The enemy doesn't need to destroy you. He just needs to distract you long enough for you to disconnect from God's direction. Distraction is the silent killer of destiny. It keeps you active but unproductive, loud but spiritually deaf, moving but not advancing. You can pray, you can fast, you can go to church, but if you're not focused, you'll still miss the message. When was the last time you sat in silence and said, "Speak, Lord, I'm listening"? Not scrolling, not worrying, not rushing, just listening. God's voice is consistent, but your attention is not. And that's why so many people live frustrated. They expect divine clarity while living in constant distraction. You can't have both. You've got to choose. You've got to protect your focus like your future depends on it, because it does. God reveals secrets to the focused, not to the frantic. He gives instruction to the intentional, not to the impulsive. The greatest breakthroughs often come in the quiet moments when the noise fades and your spirit finally settles enough to hear what he's been saying all along. That's why the enemy fights your peace so hard, because he knows peace produces perception. If he can keep you restless, you'll stay disconnected. But when you choose peace, you choose power. When you make room for silence, you make room for strategy. Distraction isn't just about what you're looking at. It's about what you're letting control your mind. Every notification, every fear, every worry, each one is stealing a piece of your awareness. And awareness determines alignment. The more aware you are of God's presence, the clearer his voice becomes. You've got to stop giving your attention to things that don't feed your spirit. Every time you choose prayer over panic, stillness over scrolling, obedience over opinion, you're strengthening your ability to hear from God. You've got to realize that God's voice isn't hiding. It's waiting for you to unplug, to quiet down, to get serious about your focus. The moment you start honoring silence as sacred, you'll begin hearing answers you've been begging for. Because the issue isn't that God's not speaking, it's that you've been too distracted to notice. When you remove the noise, the clarity comes. When you silence the world, the whisper of heaven becomes undeniable. The only reason you haven't heard him is because your focus has been divided. But the moment you reclaim it, everything begins to shift. You think God's silence means he's distant, but sometimes silence is his strategy. When God goes quiet, he's not ignoring you. He's preparing you. He's aligning your heart, testing your patience, and building your spiritual hearing. You can't rush his timing. You can't demand his voice on your schedule. God doesn't speak just to comfort you. He speaks to position you. And sometimes before he gives you the next instruction, he needs to see if you can handle stillness without losing faith. That silence you're frustrated with is the training ground for your next level of clarity. When God seems silent, that's when you're supposed to lean in closer, not pull away. Most people quit too early because they confuse silence with absence. But silence isn't a sign he's left you. It's proof he's working behind the scenes. God's silence has a purpose. It teaches you to trust his character even when you can't trace his hand. It forces you to stop living by feelings and start walking by faith. Because real faith doesn't need constant confirmation. It stands on conviction. You can't expect divine direction if you're not willing to sit in divine stillness. Silence isn't punishment, it's preparation. When God stops speaking, it's because he's already given you something to obey. He doesn't waste words. He's not going to give you new instructions until you've acted on the last ones. If you're not hearing his voice, maybe it's because you've ignored his last command. You don't need another prophecy, you need obedience. God's not going to tell you step 2 if you haven't moved on step 1. The silence is where faith grows. It's where your trust deepens. It's where your character is refined. God is not interested in creating emotionally dependent believers who panic every time he goes quiet. He's building mature believers who can walk confidently, knowing that even when he's silent, he's still sovereign. That's how spiritual hearing develops, not in constant noise, but in the quiet where your spirit learns to recognize his presence without sound. When you understand that silence is a language, you stop fearing it. You start realizing that God's quiet moments are filled with instruction, but you've got to listen differently. It's not about hearing with your ears. It's about perceiving with your spirit. That's where peace replaces panic, where patience replaces pressure, and where purpose becomes clear. God's silence is his way of saying, trust me with what you can't see. And when you trust him in silence, he rewards you with revelation. Sometimes God's silence is protecting you from something you're not ready for. If he gave you all the details right now, you might rush the process or mishandle the blessing. So he withholds information until your heart is steady enough to carry it. He's silent because he's strengthening your discernment. He's silent because he's developing your discipline. He's silent because he's turning your dependency from results to relationship. When you can worship through silence, that's when you've grown. When you can say, God, I don't hear you, but I still trust you. That's when heaven opens again, because his silence is not rejection, it's refinement. It's the process of removing everything in you that competes with his presence. God's silence doesn't mean the story is over. It means he's writing something deeper than your understanding can grasp. You may not hear him now, but he's shaping your next chapter in ways you can't yet see. Faith is the frequency that tunes your spirit to God's voice. You can't hear heaven when your heart is filled with doubt. You can't pick up divine signals if your belief is buried under frustration. God speaks to those who expect him to. Faith isn't about hoping he'll speak. It's about knowing he already is. The question isn't whether God is talking. It's whether your faith is tuned to listen. Faith isn't emotion, it's alignment. It's standing firm when everything around you says quit. It's believing the promise even when the proof is missing. God doesn't respond to panic, he responds to belief. Every time you choose faith over fear, you amplify the voice of God in your life. When your faith is weak, confusion becomes loud. But when your faith is strong, clarity follows. Faith doesn't wait for the situation to look right before listening for direction. Faith hears before it sees. That's why some people miss what God is saying. They're waiting for visible signs instead of trusting in visible truth. God's not going to shout when your heart is filled with doubt. He's not going to confirm what unbelief keeps canceling. You want to hear him believe before you receive. Step in faith before the evidence shows up. Faith sharpens your discernment. It clears the static. It removes the interference of fear, anxiety, and overthinking. The voice of God doesn't compete with disbelief. It retreats from it. Doubt is like spiritual interference. It blocks the signal. But when you choose to trust him, even when it doesn't make sense, your spiritual connection strengthens. God's frequency is always clear to those who refuse to let fear dictate their focus. When you believe his word more than your worry, his whisper becomes louder than your problem. Faith is not about comfort. It's about conviction. It doesn't mean you won't feel uncertain. It means you move forward anyway. Every act of faith attracts divine communication. God speaks in proportion to your trust. The more you lean in with belief, the more he reveals. Some people want clarity before commitment, but faith doesn't work that way. You commit first and clarity comes later. You obey first and then direction unfolds. That's why Abraham heard God's voice so clearly. He moved before the map was given. His faith created frequency. Your life follows the sound you trust. If you trust fear, you'll follow confusion. If you trust faith, you'll follow clarity. When you believe what God said more than what you see, you start walking in a new dimension of awareness. You start recognizing his hand in things others overlook. You start hearing instructions others ignore. Faith tunes you into the supernatural while everyone else is stuck in the natural. Faith doesn't need a crowd to confirm what God said. It doesn't wait for agreement. It's personal. It's powerful and it's precise. When you step into faith, you silence every other competing voice, doubt, fear, insecurity, opinion, and suddenly God's direction becomes undeniable. You can't operate in faith and frustration at the same time. One will always silence the other. If you want to hear God consistently, train your spirit to believe constantly. When your faith rises, your hearing clears. God's voice becomes recognizable because your trust is stable. The moment you choose faith over feelings, the confusion that once clouded your spirit starts to fade. You begin to realize God's been speaking the whole time. You were just tuned to the wrong frequency. Faith doesn't make him speak louder. It makes you listen better. It's the bridge between your confusion and his clarity, between your weakness and his wisdom. Faith doesn't just hear, it understands. And the more you grow in it, the more you'll hear the sound of heaven guiding every step you take. Obedience is the doorway to hearing God's voice. You can pray all day, you can fast for weeks, but if you don't act on what God already told you, the next instruction won't come. God doesn't waste words on disobedience. He's not going to give you a new command when you've ignored the last one. Every time you obey, you unlock a new level of clarity. Every time you delay, you create spiritual distance. Obedience isn't about convenience. It's about commitment. It's not about what feels easy. It's about what builds discipline. God speaks to those who move when he says move, not to those who wait until it's comfortable. People say they can't hear God, but the truth is they don't want to do what he said. They want confirmation, not correction. They want blessing without surrender. But obedience is the proof that you trust his voice. You can't say you love God and ignore his direction. When you obey, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, heaven responds because obedience is faith in motion. It's belief translated into action. It's your spirit saying, God, I trust you more than my logic. And that's when his voice becomes unmistakable. Disobedience clouds discernment. It hardens the heart and dulls the spirit. Every time you choose your comfort over his command, you make it harder to hear the next word. God doesn't stop speaking, but disobedience changes your ability to receive. That's why obedience isn't optional. It's spiritual alignment. When you walk in obedience, your heart stays tuned to his frequency. You start recognizing his voice in every detail, every decision, every delay. God reveals himself to those who are ready to respond, not just ready to listen. Obedience doesn't always make sense at first, but it always makes miracles happen. Think about it. Every breakthrough in Scripture came through obedience. Noah built the ark before the rain came. Abraham left his home before he knew the destination. Peter threw his net one more time after a night of failure. None of them waited for proof. They acted on the promise. That's what obedience looks like. It moves even when understanding hasn't caught up yet. And because they obeyed, they heard God clearer the next time he spoke. When you obey, you silence confusion. When you hesitate, you invite chaos. God's instructions are often the very things that unlock your next level. You're not waiting on God to speak. He's waiting on you to move. Every time you follow his word, you prove your readiness for more revelation. You show heaven that you can be trusted with direction. That's when his voice becomes consistent because you've shown consistency in following it. Obedience isn't just about action. It's about posture. It's about saying, God, I'm available even when I don't understand. It's not just doing what he says. It's being who he called you to be. When your heart is positioned to obey, you start walking in divine rhythm. You'll notice how God begins to give you instructions before problems appear. That's the result of obedience. It activates intimacy. The more you obey, the more you understand his tone, his timing, and his truth. You can't live in rebellion and expect revelation. You can't walk in partial obedience and expect full direction. God doesn't bless halfway surrender. If you want to hear him clearly, you have to trust him completely. Obedience unlocks overflow. It positions you under divine favor. It opens doors that logic can't. When you move with immediate obedience, you create an atmosphere where God's voice flows freely because obedience tells heaven, I'm ready, and heaven always responds to readiness. Stillness is the breeding ground for clarity. In a world that worships movement, God often meets you in moments of quiet. You can't hear divine instruction when your mind never rests. You can't discern his whisper when your soul is racing from one distraction to another. Stillness isn't weakness, it's spiritual strength. It's the power to pause when everything around you is demanding motion. When you learn to be still, you stop reacting to pressure and start responding to presence. God doesn't speak through chaos. He speaks through calm. The more you practice stillness, the clearer his voice becomes. So many people are addicted to movement. They think productivity equals progress, but sometimes motion is just noise. You can be busy and still be spiritually blind. You can be active and still miss what God is saying. Stillness teaches you that peace is not the absence of activity. It's the presence of alignment. When your heart rests in God, your spirit becomes sensitive to his instruction. Stillness isn't about doing nothing. It's about tuning everything else out until all that remains is him. The enemy knows that if he can't stop you, he'll distract you. That's why he keeps you rushing, worrying, and overthinking, because when your mind is overloaded, your spirit can't hear. Here, stillness breaks that cycle. It resets your spiritual rhythm. It reminds you that you're not the source, God is. You don't have to figure everything out. You just have to stay positioned. When you learn to sit in silence and wait on his presence, you start seeing what others overlook. You start hearing what others miss. Stillness is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of sensitivity. Stillness is where strength is built. It's where your confidence in God becomes unshakable. When you stop running from the quiet, you realize that's where transformation happens. God works in silence. Growth happens underground before it's visible above. Stillness is that underground space where your roots go deep. It's where God develops your endurance, shapes your character, and fine-tunes your focus. Without stillness, you'll mistake activity for purpose. You'll confuse business with obedience. You'll keep moving, but never hear the direction that leads to destiny. In stillness, you begin to understand the rhythm of heaven. You stop forcing doors open and start trusting divine timing. You stop worrying about how and start focusing on who. When you quiet the world, the word becomes alive. Scripture starts speaking in ways it never did before. You begin to recognize patterns, nudges, confirmations, signs that God has been guiding you all along. Stillness doesn't remove problems, but it gives you perspective. It allows you to see that God's been present in every delay, every detour, every disappointment. The hardest part of stillness is surrendering control. It requires trust to wait without panic. It demands faith to stop striving and simply rest in his promise. But that's where the shift happens. That's where his peace takes over and your understanding gives up its need to control. The moment you stop fighting for answers, revelation begins to flow. God speaks most clearly to hearts that are quiet enough to listen. Stillness isn't a pause in purpose, it's preparation for power. It's the divine moment between prayer and breakthrough. It's the space where you recharge your faith and renew your strength. When you rest in God, you don't lose time, you redeem it. You walk away with strategy, confidence, and discernment. The noise of life fades, and his whisper becomes unmistakable. Stillness positions you to receive what movement kept you from hearing. Because when your soul finally settles, heaven starts speaking.